Hello, thank you so much for joining me for another Assemble This video. Today's card is all about using a layering stencil to watercolor with. It's such an easy way to create a beautiful abstract watercolor look that anyone can do, including me. I'm featuring the Birthday Bloom stamp and stencil from Unity Stamp Company. This bundle works so well together to create some really gorgeous peonies. I have all my supplies set to go. I have my stencil. I also have a bit of Fabriano watercolor paper, and I just taped that down onto my work surface. And then I taped my stencil down as well. I'm starting out with the largest stencil area, and I grabbed some Karen or Karine, however you want to say it, Brush Marker Pro watercolor pens, and I just scribbled a bit down onto my acrylic block. I'm using a watercolor aqua brush. This time it has water in the barrel, and I'm just using a light amount of water to kind of pick up that pigment from the acrylic block and filling in the larger sections of the stencil. As you can tell, I'm not being too careful. I'm just scribbling that on into each area. I do want to make sure that it doesn't bleed too much underneath the stencil. So I'm keeping the water to a minimum and just doing a light layer. And it doesn't have to be an even coverage. That's what I love about watercoloring. It just has a lot of depth and movement within the pigment, so it doesn't have to be a nice smooth layer. We're just kind of letting the watercolor do its thing and filling in each little area of the stencil. Once that was done, I let that dry. I might have hit it with a heat tool just to make sure it was completely dry. I don't think I mentioned I'm using the Soft Peach 2 color of the Korean markers, and I'm doing a second layer of that same exact color just to kind of deepen it. I did change to the second layer of the stencil. This has the medium sized petals, and I'm just filling those in with my ink. I'm trying not to cover the whole area. I'm using the bottom part of the petal to create a bit of shadow and just filling a portion of that. It's okay if it fills the whole area of the stencil. It's part of the watercolor look. Again, we're kind of building up layers, and the movement of the watercolor just kind of fills everything in. Keeping my water again to a minimum just so it layers and stays within those little areas of the stencil, so it kind of pulls and moves and creates the shape of the petals. So I'm just going along building up a second layer that creates a bit more depth to those petals. When I'm running out a bit of ink, I just scribble a bit more down onto that acrylic block. I did squeeze a bit of water onto my acrylic block as well. Sometimes when you squeeze the barrel of the pen, you get too much water, so I wanted to be able to control that a little bit more just by being able to pick it up with the brush and then kind of mix it in with the pigment that I have on the acrylic block. So I'm just going along and filling in all the little areas of the stencil and letting the watercolor kind of do its thing. Moving on to the third portion of the flower stencil. This is the smallest one of the bunch. This is the way I chose to use the stencil. And this time I picked up a bit darker of a color. I'm using the fire red, and I scribbled that onto my acrylic block. And again, picking it up with just a little bit of water and focusing on filling in that area of the stencil. Just going to create the depth of the flower for us. What's so nice about these layering stencils is they do all the hard work for us. They've already determined what is the lightest portion, the medium portion, and the smallest, darkest portion. And so I'm using that fire red to really kind of create the depth of the flower and fill in the smallest portion of this stencil set. And again, I'm keeping my water fairly minimum, just so it doesn't bleed too much underneath that stencil, and I still have the dimension of each of those petals. Next, I grabbed almond, and I'm free filling in that center area of the flower, trying to create the idea of the stencil by keeping a little bit of a white border, and then I'm just building up the depth of that color. I laid down one layer of the almond and I let it dry, and then I'm just tapping on a bit more depth using the pen directly. Now I did separate out my stencils. I cut them apart, so my leaves are separate from my flowers, and that was mainly for storage reasons. You don't have to do that. I just needed a way to be able to store them because they're so big. And so now I'm moving on to the leaves, and I'm using the largest portion of the leaf stencil. And I'm mixing some colors this time from the carrying. I had some pattern paper that I'm trying to match. I wanted more of a mint color, so I mixed apple and ocean teal. I'll probably use a little bit of lush green in there as well. That's probably for the next layer. So those are the three colors that I used from Kireen. And I mixed apple and ocean teal just to kind of get that light mint color. And I added a lot of water in there just to really lighten it up since it was so deep. And I'm just filling in the portions of the leaves that are around the edge of the flower. I decided not to add the leaf portion inside the middle of the flower because I thought it would get too muddy layering the green over the pink. I was afraid I'd end up with brown, so I just skipped that. And I'm just kind of tapping on that watercolor, letting it move through the portions of that stencil and to create its watercolor look. So here I tapped on that darker color of the Korean markers, and I just added some water in there, and then I'm just going to focus mainly on the center bottom of the stencil. This is the next layer. It's a little bit smaller, so we know that it's a shadowing portion of the stamp or of the stencil, so it creates a deeper, darker dimension. And I'm just filling those in, just kind of eyeballing how I want the look. I don't have to exactly fill the whole area of the stencil, but I'm using it as a guide so I can kind of get that dimension of shadowing. Then I set that aside, let it dry completely. You could also use your heat tool just to make sure it's dried. And then I tore the bottom and the top edges. I just really like the idea of the torn look for this card. Next, I got out my Misty, and I'm going to stamp the sentiment from the Birthday Blooms stamp set, the Happy Birthday one. I picked some Gina K ink in Moonlight Fog. I like the idea of the gray. Again, it kind of matched the pattern papers that I was going for and using. So I'm just doing that a couple times. It is watercolor paper, so it just needs a couple layers to get a nice solid impression. I tore some strips of vellum and then this gray chevron or houndstooth pattern paper, adding to that layered look of the torn edges. And I'm just kind of eyeballing this. I laid them down, and then I'm using my pencil to kind of mark where I need to glue them down onto my card front. So just like that, and then I'm going to place my center panel back and then line up the other edges of my vellum and pattern paper here. So it's really kind of the lazy man's way of doing this. I use my eye to kind of place rather than measuring, and then once it looks good to me, I'll use my pencil to kind of determine where I want to glue those down onto the card. And this way the layers are going to hide the adhesive behind that vellum, so I'm not so worried about what adhesive I'm using because it's going to be hidden behind all the layers of pattern paper and our watercolored flowers. Just going to trim those off so they match the edge of the card. Super simple. And then just to kind of make that center panel pop, I'm going to add some foam adhesive back behind there. I love this big foam adhesive from scrapbook.com. I use it all the time. It's a staple now. I can't live without it. Just going to take the backing off of that and then place it down straight in the middle of those strips. And don't you just love those torn edges? I think it's just a fun look. And then to finish everything off, I'm just going to add a few sequins and gems in gold and kind of a pinkish clear color. Just adds a bit more movement and shine to the card, and for me, just kind of finishes everything off. You could also do a bow or some enamel dots, maybe some glitter or something. I always like to add a little bit of shine. And here is the finished card with that faux kind of watercolor artistic look of those peonies, and it's just so sweet and so easy to create. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll have the supplies linked in the description of this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And of course, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you were inspired, and I'll see you next time.